So, let's say you want to create your own sliders for your own control panel, like you've seen for characters and in some cases for machines or vehicles. First, you're going to need to create basically a container for it. So, usually, want to create some sort of a square or rectangle axis panel. And that's usually created by using NURBS curves. Now, you could use the NURBS square, but that usually comes up in pieces. So, I tend to use the CV curve tool and go to the option box, set the curve degree to linear, and this is so that when I create a point and then create the next point and the third, it doesn't try to curve my spline. Instead, it actually just maintains the sharp corners. So right now I'm actually using the snap to grid option, which is this button up here, and I'm just pressing X on the keyboard to toggle it on, and I'm snapping to the grid approximately 1 unit away from 0. So that's 1 unit is basically the maximum distance I want my slider to travel within the box or within the slider area. So this is going to be my slider area. So I'm just going to call this one my slider frame. And always get into the habit of naming everything. It's just a good practice to have. And so right now, I've got my first slider box. I'm actually going to duplicate that and set one aside so I can use it for something else. So first I'm going to show you how to create the box slider, where you can actually create a slider that basically moves in every direction, so you can actually set it up to control multiple elements within one box. So then you basically want to create a little handle to act as your slider. So for that I usually just use a simple circle, scale it down to the size I want it to be, delete any history, always delete creation history on any elements you create, and then I'm going to modify and freeze transformations on it just to zero out its scale. And then I'm just going to select the curve for my frame and just press P. So now it's parented to it, so it'll follow that frame wherever it goes. But besides the fact that it'll follow anywhere it goes, if I decide to scale the box down, the curve within, well, my little selection handle, will still have to travel approximately 1 unit to get to the edge of the box. So this way I can create what are called 0 to 1 sliders and have them at any size that I need, because the frame is controlling its perspective on what the actual world looks like. So as far as the curve on the inside is concerned, it never changes at all. Okay, and so that's the basics of creating our slider and slider box. I'm going to duplicate that, set it aside, and again, make sure you're labeling your sliders. Usually once you actually have a specific function for them, you want to label them accordingly. Like if this was going to be my blink slider, I'd label it blink, just for example. Now that you have a slider, it's time to set a few limits for how far it can slide. Now in this case, we only want it to slide as far as 1, no further. So simply select your slider handle, and so I'll just generically call this one slider for now, since it's not actually controlling anything yet. And go to the attribute editor. So press Control A on your keyboard, brings up the attribute editor, and go to the very first tab, which should have the exact same name as your slider, and go to Limit Information and expand Translate. Now the orientation of your slider is going to be consistent with the global orientation. So the translate Z, the translate Z, translate X, and translate Y. Now you're probably not going to be using Y at all if you're making a slider panel, because usually slider panels are going to be only 2-dimensional in their function. So you don't really need to worry about the Y. So simply with the curve selected, simply go to Translate Limit X, set them in, click the checkbox directly next to it, which activates the negative maximum, and then the positive maximum, and do the same thing for the Translate Z. once done, when you translate your curve in either one of those directions, it can't go any further than 1 unit. And so now you have a slider that's locked in to that range. And so you can actually slide it pretty much 1 unit in any one of those directions. Now one thing you want to do is, once you do have your slider's limitations defined in that sense, you can go in and actually lock and hide all of its other attributes. So simply left click and select over all of the other attributes. So you want to leave translate Z and only the translate X available, and then just lock and hide by right clicking, and then you've hidden all of the other attributes. So now when you grab your controller, whether you grab it from a specific axis or directly from the middle, it only slides within that 1 unit of space. Okay, and when you type in 0, it goes back to dead center. And this will be the case no matter what size that little panel piece is. So if I come in, it's like my very tiny now slider, it still can't go outside of that box. So it's basically a perfect 1-to-1 slider, which can be any scale. Since they are NURBS curves, you can always go in and right click and edit the CVs. So you can scale it, you can change its shape, you can rebuild it, but it's always going to go no further than 1 unit based on its pivot point, or relative to its pivot point. So now let's say you wanted to make just a slider that goes in one direction. So either it goes along the Z, top to bottom, or left to right. Simply duplicate that one, move it over, and then you can take your CVs for the square and then bring them in so it forms more of a central outline for your slider. And then take your slider that you've limited, and that attribute, whichever attribute you don't want it to use, simply lock it. So you can take the translate X, which is left to right, and I can just lock and hide that, so that now this slider only functions in the Z-axis. So now I have a standard linear slider, and then I have a slider that goes in all 4 directions. Now finally, usually it's a good idea to label your sliders, because as is, it's sort of difficult to tell what they are until you actually select them or test them. So usually it's a good idea to assign labels using Maya's text tool. However, when you create the text, so I'll create some text and I'll just call it slider, and I'm going to create it as curves, so make sure your type is curves, and choose whichever font you're going to use, and then create your text. So when you create your text, if you look in the outliner, you'll actually see it creates all of those curves within existing groups. Now if you leave it in those groups, there can actually be display problems when your panels are brought up on other people's computers, partially because it's still connecting to certain histories, and partially because maybe their default settings would be a little different from yours. So usually what you want to do is take those groups and start ungrouping them. So ungroup and ungroup, and just keep going until you have nothing left except curves. Once you just have curves, then you want to set it up so that your label is going to be connected to a specific panel. So you can either you can do one of two things. So you could just take your curves, rotate them, align them, do whatever you're going to do to make them align with your panel, slide them into place, scale them, do whatever you're going to do. And so let's say I'm going to stick that right there, and I want to actually scale this down a bit. So let me see if it'll let me do that. So it's scaling them individually. If I want to scale them all together, I can group them and then just scale the group down. And I can position it. I can get rid of my group. And then what I could do is I could just parent these directly to my frame. Or actually, if I want to do this easily, I can keep the group, parent the group to the frame, and I'm just going to label my group. Always get to label your groups, and we'll just call this one slider text group. And so since it's parented to our frame and we know we want it to stay there and always be there, we can, while we have the group selected, you can go to the attribute editor and you can come down to the display level and drawing overrides, enable your drawing overrides for the group and set it for reference. This will lock our label so it can't be selected, but since that group is parented to our slider, it goes where that group goes, scales with it, and everything else, so it's always visible. Okay? And so that's the easy way to label your slider.